And please pray with me. Come to us, Holy Spirit, and speak to us today. Speak to us the words of Scripture so we might hear your words of blessing for us, and that you might transform us into salt and light for the world. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen. So we're continuing our 9-week series called All I Really Need to Know I Learned from Jesus. This is based on the Robert Fulghum poem and book called All I Really Need to Know I Learned in Kindergarten. Maybe you've heard that poem or that essay before, where he has those simple list of rules. Play fair, share everything, don't hit people, put things back where you found them. Part of the brilliance of Robert Fulghum's little poem there is that it takes the complexity of our world, the complexity of our life, and reminds us of some of those simple rules that guide us to live a good life in the world. Some of those things that we learned all the way back when we were little in kindergarten. But if you want to figure out how to go out into the world and live a good life, just remember to play fair, to share. Don't hit people. So part of what we're doing in this series is we're taking some of those pieces of kindergarten wisdom and connecting them to the life lessons and the guide for discipleship that we get in the life of Christ. So kindergarten wisdom is good, but we're taking it a step further by saying all I really need to know I learned from Jesus. So the piece of kindergarten wisdom that we're dwelling in today and bringing into connection with our scripture is warm cookies and cold milk are good for you. So in kindergarten we learned that warm cookies and cold milk are good for you. We're going to connect that today to our reading from the Gospel of Matthew. So I see this bit of wisdom that warm cookies and cold milk are good for you as a reminder to taste and see the blessing in our midst. Because if you think about it in one way, there's a sense in which warm cookies and cold milk are not good for you. You can make a case for the nutritional value of milk, but if you only eat cookies, it's not going to be good for you over the long term, right? But there's another way in which warm cookies and cold milk are good for you. Cookies might not have much nutritional value, but there are those times where only a cookie will cut it. I think about Christmas time when we pass a plate of Christmas cookies. It wouldn't have the same effect as passing around a plate of carrots, right? It wouldn't be as celebratory. It wouldn't knit us together as a family quite as much to pass around carrots as it would be to pass around cookies. Or perhaps you have a friend who's having a bad day, or maybe a child who's had a bad day, and it wouldn't be the same to give them a different piece of food, maybe a piece of fruit, as it would be to say, here, sit down and let's have a cookie together. Sometimes only a cookie will cut it. Or maybe there are those family memories that, only those cookies that Grandma could make or something like that. I don't know how many Harry Potter fans we have here, but I'm a big Harry Potter fan. And there's these characters in the Harry Potter world called Dementors, which live off of human happiness. They're these dark creatures that live off of human happiness. They suck the happiness out of people. They're the guards of the prisoners in Azkaban because they keep them controlled by sucking the happiness out of them. So these dark mystical creatures called Dementors. And there's this scene where Harry Potter and his friends encounter Dementors for the first time. And Professor Lupin, a professor at Hogwarts School, rescues them with a Patronus charm, casting out the Dementor. And afterwards, they're all feeling down. One of the characters says that it felt like he would never be happy again when he was in the presence of a Dementor. And so one of Professor Lupin's suggestions to them to feel better is to eat some chocolate. That when they were in that dark place with that dark creature, one of the ways to recover was to eat some chocolate, something that might bring them a little bit of happiness, a little bit of sweetness in the midst of that. It kind of reminds me of what people call soul food. You know, in different communities, different cultures have different kinds of soul food. But often soul foods aren't the most healthy choice, right? They're maybe not something that you should eat every day, but they're something that feeds a different part of you, something that feeds your soul. It kind of reminds me when we had our Rumagrit fellowship back in the end of November. You probably don't want to eat Rumagrit every day, but it feeds a different part of you, right? It's food that feeds your soul. And so I kind of think that's part of the wisdom of warm cookies and cold milk are good for you, is that there are foods that we eat not necessarily because they feed us nutritionally, but because they feed us in the soul, at the soul level. Sometimes we need to pause and take in the sweetness of life. Because our world can be bitter, our lives can have bitterness in them, and we need to pause and taste the sweetness and the blessings of life. I wonder if this is why we give cookies and milk to kids. We know that they're going to encounter tough things in their life, encounter frustration and bitterness, but sometimes we need them to pause and just remember that there are good things about life too. There are warm cookies and cold milk. So now I want to make a jump from warm cookies and cold milk to our reading from Jesus. Because I think in a way you're doing something kind of similar to this piece of kindergarten wisdom. We're reading today what are often called the Beatitudes. Blessed are the poor in spirit, blessed are the merciful, blessed are the peacemakers. Beatitude comes from the Latin word for blessing. It's Jesus announcing blessing and divine favor to people. And the Beatitudes take part in a larger reading from chapter 5 to chapter 7 in Matthew. That's called the Sermon on the Mount. It's kind of Jesus' first big discourse, where he's teaching them what the kingdom of heaven is going to be all about. And part of what I see Jesus doing is announcing the sweetness of life, the divine favor of life, the blessing of life in the midst of a bitter world. There's an interesting thing that happens in Jesus' ministry that happens in all four Gospels, that as he begins to teach and heal, it's not necessarily the powerful and the rich who are drawn to him or the people who think they're the holiest. It's often the people who are in some ways the most broken, and some ways the people who are most ostracized. Right before this reading in chapter 5 and chapter 4 of Matthew, it says that as Jesus is teaching, it's the blind and the lame and the leper and the outcast who are drawn to Jesus. These crowds of people are circling around him. And it's not necessarily the most successful people in the world. It's the people who are most in need of a little bit of sweetness in their life. We could put it this way. Those people that the world calls cursed, Jesus calls blessed. We might look at people, these people who are drawn to Jesus as people who are cursed in some way, people who just have been dealt an unfair hand in life. But it's those people that are most drawn to Jesus. And in these Beatitudes, Jesus, in a way, gives us a new way of looking at blessing. I think we tend to think of blessing as those times when things are going well for us, when we're getting more and more money, when we're getting more and more popular, that we call that blessing. But Jesus gives us almost an upside-down view of blessing. He says, blessed are you when people curse you and people revile you. He says, blessed are the merciful. He says, blessed are the meek. He says, blessed are the poor in spirit. Blessed are those who are grieving. He kind of turns our understanding of blessing all the way upside down. And in this way, the Beatitudes point ahead to the story of Jesus' death and resurrection, the cross and the empty tomb. The cross teaches us that God meets us in our suffering. And the empty tomb teaches us that God makes a new way forward possible. I'll say that one more time. The cross teaches us that Jesus meets us in our suffering. And the empty tomb teaches us that God will make a new way forward possible. And that's what we see in these Beatitudes as well. Jesus doesn't name the people who are doing the best by the world standards. He names the people who are suffering, the people who need divine favor the most. Blessed are those who are poor in spirit. Blessed are those who grieve. The Beatitudes point forward to the cross, point forward to a God who meets us in our suffering and makes a new way forward possible. So Jesus brings out the sweetness in life for people who've experienced the bitterness of the world. But something else that we learn in our reading for today is that blessing is meant to flow. That when we receive blessing, we're meant to pass it on. And this is a big theme of the Bible, going all the way back to the story of Abraham, where God blessed Abraham to be a blessing for others. And likewise here, Jesus begins by announcing blessing, but then he turns right away to being salt and light for the world. That when you are blessed, you in turn are called to be a blessing for others. When you are given a taste of the sweetness of life, you are called to pass on that sweetness for others. So Jesus uses the metaphor of salt and light, but I wonder if, given our theme for today of warm cookies and cold milk, we could think of ourselves as sharing the sweetness of life for others in a sometimes bitter world. It strikes me that cookies are best when shared. It's hard to make a single cookie and enjoy it by yourself, right? Most recipes call for a dozen or more at a time. And I think it's not only that, but it's best when you share a cookie with another person. So perhaps we could add to Jesus' metaphors this one. You are warm cookies and cold milk for the world. You are called to drink in the sweetness of life that God gives you, and then in turn go out and be cookies for others. Because God's blessing is meant to flow. God meets you in your suffering wherever you are in your journey today. And God makes a new way forward possible. And in that sweetness, Jesus in turn turns around and says, go and be that same thing for others. So as you go out today, remember that warm cookies and cold milk are good for you. And may the sweetness of life reach you in bitter moments. May the light of the world, the light of Christ, meet you in your dark places. And may you be blessed so that you can be a blessing for others. May you go out and be the sweetness of life for others. A plate of warm cookies and a glass of cold milk.